in the middle of doing a series of talks on loving kindness and compassion. And I wanted to, as you know from my last talk on it, that I wanted to bring it a bit out of the conceptual and into just some practical kinds of ways of practicing with it and ways of not being discouraged, I guess. Like all of us, my mind and my heart have been really reeling with the anguish of Israel and Gaza. And then we wake in the middle of the night with concerns about that and all the isms that we're dealing with as a culture, ongoing isms and conflicts and rancor. And you know, one thing that strikes me about the Israel-Gaza conflict is the teaching on karma and the Buddhist teachings. Hatred never ceases by hatred. Ouch. Hatred never ceases by hatred. By love alone is hatred healed. And we can have that as kind of an interesting concept, and then we find ourselves struggling when it comes right down to that person in my family, or the next door neighbor whose dog won't stop barking, or, you know, when we bring it right down into the dailiness of our practice, we can really struggle. Well, how do you do that? Or for that matter, just reading the headlines in the morning paper, you know, how do you really do that? And we could imagine that the practice is to somehow kind of torque ourselves into, you know, being good enough or loving enough or kind enough or compassionate enough. And Siddhartha, over 2,600 years ago, when he was wondering, he really had the same kinds of dilemmas. He saw suffering. You know, he really got it. And he went, what, you know, how do we do this? How do we be with this? So we're in really good company when we have those questions of, how do I bring loving kindness to the, let's say, to the isms that we have to deal with, or to the war in Israel-Gaza? How do we do that? We're in very good company. And when I spoke the last time, I asked you to offer some questions, and your questions are so awesome. And it really strikes me that many of you asked sort of similar questions. How to reach out in yourself, how to reach in yourself any kindness for those who have and would continue to wish harm for you and your Jewish or Muslim or gay or Asian or trans community, if given a chance. You know, as you're wondering, how do I do that? You asked about your relatives. You asked about fathers who refer to their lesbian daughters, your own beloved niece, as, quote, the devil's abomination. How do you do loving kindness and compassion with that? You asked how to have loving kindness for dear friends, long-standing friends who have betrayed you. You asked how to have kindness for the overwhelm of the climate catastrophe. Well, that cheers us up, doesn't it? You know? How do we navigate with all this? And I deliberately picked out of your questions some of the biggest ones. Because those are those places where we can really kind of find ourselves. It's like, okay, if I were really good at this, I could like torque myself into being, loving and kind and compassionate and, for Hamas. And maybe that's not quite exactly how to go about it. It might be the end result, but it might not be how to go about it. So I'd like to speak to a couple of general principles tonight, and then put a bit of a finer point on it in the next talk. I keep promising I'll give you pointers next time. But I want to offer 3 general principles tonight, and then the next time really bring it down even more finely. So the first general principle, which is what Siddhartha, as he became enlightened and became the enlightened Buddha, came to realize, that first noble truth. There is dukkha. There is stress. There is suffering. Dukkha is the word for suffering. There is. And when I really contemplate that myself, I notice that in my mind has a little editor who kind of goes on in the background, says, yeah, but there shouldn't be, And furthermore, if they did, or why didn't they, and if, should, and who knows, and everybody, that my little editor, my little mind, just keeps wanting to insist that there is some circumstance in which there shouldn't be, or there can't be, or there couldn't be, or there wouldn't be, if I, you, he, the way, they were different. But the first noble truth in this human life, there is stress. There is suffering. The Buddha says, association with the undesirable is suffering. Separation from the desirable is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. Whoever encounters ill wishers, wishers of harm, wishers of discomfort, of insecurity, separation from what is wanted, liked, pleasant sights, objects, sounds, separation from well-wishers, wishers of good, of comfort, of security. This is dukkha. And this is part of this human life on this human planet. And even as I say that, you might even feel, I can even feel kind of as I speak, that there even remains a part of me that says, yeah, but there shouldn't be, there's sort of resistance to that first noble truth. And so the Buddha went on for 45 years teaching us how to navigate this circumstance, this human life. How do we navigate dukkha? How do we navigate suffering in a way that doesn't cause more suffering? How do we do this? Hatred never ceases by hatred. By love alone is hatred healed. This is an ancient and eternal law. As I pondered, when does this happen? A couple weeks ago, as I first started pondering this, I was thinking, okay, so that's the Buddhist teaching. That is really the teaching of all of the spiritual traditions. So I got this idea. So what I did was I emailed all 70 members of the clergy collective, and I said, So tell me, here's the Buddha's teaching. What is your teaching on this? This is shortly after the war began. And I'll read you a few, or some of what I received. This is from Tanvir Rizvi from the Islamic Society. He said, our faith teaches us that any innocent human life lost is a grave sin, especially for those who are perpetrating the acts of violence, irrespective of their faith. I'm going to read a few more. I'm going to ask you as I read to see what might touch your heart or ring a bell, as you listen. What resonates for you? And you might hear some commonalities or not, but just what resonates. So Tanvir Rizvi says, perpetrating acts of violence, irrespective of faith, is a grave sin. This is from Brenda Brown Grooms, who is the Baptist minister and the co-pastor of the New Beginnings Christian Church in Charlottesville. And this is based on the Song of Songs, she says. Give me your divided heart. My beloved, surrender your life's purpose to me. In my realm, there is no place for a divided heart, for all has been given to me. All that you hold in your hands and all that distracts you, lay it down before me. You will arise and not fall. You will ascend into my glorious flames, where passion and purity unite. Come away, my true friend, and make my world your home. This is what you were created for. A life of uninterrupted union with me is the foundation for a truly blessed life. I will say that, is this working? Yeah. I will say that very early on in our membership in the Clergy Collective, we and they wondered about references to God. And it's really interesting when some of the ministers get going on their prayers to really experience the different approaches. But what we have come to is very often the prayer will start, you who are known by many names. So when some of these prayers or some of these teachings come through in the Clergy Collective, we just translate it. You who are known by many names, and it's just understood. This is from Rabbi Dan Alexander with Congregation Beth Israel. God of the Spirit of all flesh, here we are before you, broken spirits, torn by grief. Have mercy on us, mortals created in your image. Watch over us in a time of destruction and tragedy, terror, death, and panic. Please, please, may our compassion be revealed. May the love within us overwhelm the harsh judgment, vengeance, and evil within us. Behold, fierce, burning pain cries out, seeking revenge, not comfort. Watch over us, Shekinah, our strength, over our scorched spirits, our terrified souls, over our completely infuriated flesh. May the divine image rise, shining like the dawn from our crushed hearts. May we have faith that we will merit to witness the goodness of the Holy One, the goodness of humankind in the land of the living. And then this is from Reverend Alex Joyner, from Charlottesville First United Methodist Church. A prayer for all the pain passed down the genes or latent in the very grain of being. Even now, my prayer is that a mind blurred by anxiety or despair might find here a trace of peace. And then from the Buddha, hatred never ceases by hatred. By love alone is hatred healed. This is an ancient and eternal law. So the truth of dukkha and the truth of cultivating non-hatred. What do you hear as you listen to all these different traditions? What resonates for you? I asked you to kind of consider anything. What do you hear?
The idea, what you just said about many names, and that psalm that you read, which I can't remember, but give me, what number, psalm what? It says, basically, give your life to me. And if we can understand that, we may understand it as God on high asking for that. But if we can understand that for God there are many names, it can be awareness, it can be being. It raises the nature in many ways of what our practice is about. If we understand it as being, devoting, no. It is no longer we who are doing it. We are being asked to recognize that we can't do it. We offer. It isn't a self that's even getting there. We are being asked by the Buddha to directly experience. I'm sorry, here I am. Maybe I'm. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm doing some teaching. This is not. Let me do this some other time. Sharon, I think that's wonderful. Thank you.
What I hear you saying, Susan, is all that you hold in your hands and all that distracts you, lay it down before me, is what Brenda's quote. It's the Song of Solomon. I'll send it to you if you want. Yeah. Yeah, John.
The Jewish rabbis' input really resonated for me because it sort of acknowledged the humanity, the reactions that are human, but it also sort of gave a goal to rise up above that. So I thought I like the practicality of that, honesty of it.
Yeah, where it talked about the anguish and the rage of my heart. Good. Yeah, Judy. I tell you, I should wear my step counter.
Your roller skates. First of all, I think this is genius, and you're asking the question. But what I want to know again is, having heard those 5 responses, what question did you ask in that email? I think you might have told us, but I wasn't prepared for what came. Could you?
Well, basically, what I asked them, I was talking about my own anguish. I don't know, Susan, what did I ask them? I was talking about my own anguish, and I said, here's what the Buddha says about this. And I know that this is not unique to Buddhism. Could you offer me something from your own tradition that is a teaching in response, because it was right after the war started, as a response to the war, could you offer a teaching from your own tradition? And so, yeah. This, by the way, is part of the teaching that I'm offering tonight, that the concept is understandable, but really when we're asked to kind of contemplate and to bring it into our own flesh and blood is where we can find ourselves getting a little sluggish. I don't want to do that. That's too hard. All right, somebody, yes. Who has something to say? Did somebody have a hand up? Nope. All right, then I will take the moment to break out of my talk to honor Linda Galley, who just got married. Yay, Linda. Yes. All right, a little sidebar there. So, how do we do this? Yeah, Jane.
I feel like this is a tangent, but I do not relate to the concept of hate as the genesis of all this perpetrating of violence and killing and everything. The only time I really apply hate sometime is when I think of these mass murders in the United States where somebody just opens up a gun and just goes into a crowd. And I realize that they have been so marginalized and unloved and so wounded that I do relate to an individual being able to hate. I feel that it is the human need for survival, for power. Now, these are two different things. These are not in the same bucket. In other words, it's the Palestinians feeling that they can't survive adequately. It is the Israelis feeling like their survival has to be super protected. And power. Anyway, so we get into these wars, and even when you study wars, I'm not sure people really identify with hating individuals or anything like that.
Well, first of all, I think a lot of people can identify with hating, but I think what you're pointing to, Jane, is really important, because what you're pointing to is that underneath that hatred, underneath those reactivities, are experiences that are hard to contain. Woundedness. I think you used the word woundedness, and marginalized. And so to kind of work with, again, dukkha. This is so really, I think what you're pointing to is there is suffering, and how do we be with suffering that doesn't just cause more suffering? Got another hand.
Just on the, I think the topic of like hatred, right? As I, listen to the Buddha and I listen to the other faiths, the hatred's taught, right? I mean, I think that's ultimately what, I always kind of walk, hatred to me, it's a taught behavior, right? If you take two children that don't know any different and you put them in a room, they don't know hatred. That's what we've taught them, right? So I kind of come back to simplicity and the practicality of, the Buddha to me is what resonates more than anything else that we heard. And I'm, I think like many, my faith, origin faith is not Buddha, but what's sort of drawn me here is the practicality of what the Buddha brings to my life. And that's the piece that so when you say what stood out is not what stood out from the other faiths, while I respect them, it's the fact that the Buddha's practicality of hatred, you can't get rid of hatred by putting more hatred on it. It's just the simplicity of it, right? It's something that as I walk out of here, I can really bring practically to my life.
We're not going to be free from suffering by causing more suffering. The inevitability of suffering, and we can bring it down to, okay, so hatred is a strong word that we may not be able to quite identify with. I remember Jack Kornfield was talking about greed, hatred, and delusion. And he said at one point, and I'm talking about greed and hatred and delusion. And I don't know about you, but I actually do know the experience of hatred. That when we have something that is really profoundly painful, that our response is to try to get rid of it, to try to strike back. So the first strategy, the first way of working with it, is to acknowledge that there is dukkha. And it just is. It just is. And then the second general strategy I wanted to offer tonight is to start where you are. And that's where some of these very big questions get us overwhelmed. Like the question about climate change or the question about the war in Gaza. To start where you are and to really consider what is, can I bring the question very close to home, or even the question about a friend who betrayed you, that we could imagine, or the question about the relative whose daughter is a devil's abomination. To kind of, okay, maybe I can't do anything about that, but where am I in this? And what's my experience? And then to begin to inquire into what is possible from where I am. And it might be that when we experience suffering, the first place, so a friend who betrayed me, or climate change, the first place, or for that matter, the war in Gaza, might be in my own heart, like the Jewish prayer, and just the anguish. Can I bring loving kindness to that? Can I bring loving kindness to the experience of feeling betrayed? Can I bring loving kindness to my confusion about climate change, or my anger, or my despair, or whatever it is? Can I bring loving kindness and compassion to this experience right here, before we try to imagine that we can do something out there? Because anything that we do out there that isn't guided by loving kindness and compassion is going to be causing more suffering, is what the Buddha is teaching us. So it's always, one, dukkha happens. Two, start where you are. Pema Chodron has a whole book about it. It's titled Start Where You Are. And sometimes where I am is overwhelmed, confused, angry, hurt, worried. Start where you are. Overwhelmed is not a problem. Overwhelmed is a signal that my nervous system is beyond its capacity. And it's a signal. It's sort of like that little gauge. My car's old, it has a little gauge. That little gauge that says my car is running out of gas. The little light comes on, the little gas tank lights up. So overwhelm is one of those little lights that comes on and says, oops, out of gas. So if we try to function when we are out of gas, it doesn't work well. And we don't criticize our cars, or for that matter, our bodies when we're hungry. We don't criticize when something needs, we need to kind of pull back and work with nourishing our own being. So some of the questions that were asked, I would respond to those by saying, bring the question closer to home. Bring the question closer to home. What's it like for you when your relatives, when your beloved niece is coming out as gay and her parents are having trouble dealing with it? What's that like for you? And what do you see as yours to do? First, what do you see as yours to do to pay attention to what it's like for you? And to cultivate a quality of clarity about that. So when we get overwhelmed, when we get in those confusing places, when we find ourselves reactive, am I the only one who ever gets reactive to things? I mean, seriously, really? Really? And sometimes it's kind of stupid, isn't it? You know, you get reactive to the cat food being in the wrong place or something, you know? You know, it's a signal that my system is overwhelmed. Sharon, honey, you need a nap. You need to go for a walk, darling. You know? So what do we need to do to bring loving kindness to our own being, for starters, so that even with respect to a discussion about the war in Gaza or climate change, that I am not causing more suffering by bringing more rancor into any kind of a discussion about that. And it may vary from moment to moment during the course of the day, how much energy and resources I have. You've heard me quote Ajahn Chah many times. He says, don't think you have a 10-wheeler truck when you have a wheelbarrow. I like that. Or in my case, don't think you have a wheelbarrow when you have a thimble. You know, just look and see what, you know, how resourced are you? Start where you are, no matter what this is: climate, war, politics, isms of all sorts, family and relationship struggles. What part of this might I cultivate a wholesome relationship with that doesn't add more frustration, more harm, more suffering, more grief, more anger, more distress? And if we get too far out there, we'll make it conceptual and not be bringing it into our own practice. I'm looking at the time. The third principle I wanted to offer is refuge, and refuge in community. That none of us can do this alone. You know, we started out tonight just being grateful for one another being here. And that we need one another's help. When I am overwhelmed, you won't be. I can come to you. You can. I remember Peter Levine, who is a trauma expert, who knows, you know, is one of these people who knows everything there is to know about trauma. And he had an auto accident. And a car hit him and he was lying on the ground. He was conscious. He was lying on the ground. And he still talks about the fact that some woman came and just sat with him. And that her presence, her nervous system, helped him just be calm. She didn't say anything. She just sat with him. And he talks about how incredibly valuable that was, her simple presence, because her nervous system wasn't agitated in the same way that his was. So the third principle is community, refuge in Sangha. looking to one another and not trying to do this alone, not trying to kind of somehow create a self, a person who is loving and kind and compassionate. And you know what, I'm way more loving and kind and compassionate than you are, is really not quite what the teaching is. That, you know, as Susan was pointing us to earlier, you know, that the love and the kindness and the compassion exists, and can we drop into it, no matter what the circumstance is, and be nourished by it, so that we can in turn nourish others. You've heard me quote Mike Tyson. He says, "Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face." You know, so we can have a Buddhist plan of loving kindness and compassion, but when we get punched in the face, it really is where the rubber meets the road. And it can show us, it can show me, it can show you, whether we have a wheelbarrow or a thimble or a 10-wheeler. And start where you are. That's where to work. It doesn't matter whether I have a thimble or a 10-wheeler. What matters is that I'm working right there at that doorway. I think I have time for this. This is from Helen Farrar, who's online, I think. Yes, she is. And I've read this before, but I love it, so I'm going to read it again. It's a little story that she found. It's sometimes I just want it to stop. Talk of COVID, protests, wars, looting, deaths, brutality. I lose my way. I become convinced that this new normal is real life. But then I meet an 87-year-old who talks of living through polio, diphtheria, Vietnam protests, and yet is still enchanted with life. He seemed surprised when I said that 2023 must be especially challenging for him. No, he said slowly, looking me straight in the eyes. I learned a long time ago to not see the world through the printed headlines. I see the world through the people that surround me. I see the world through the realization that we love big. Therefore, I just choose to write my own headlines. Husband loves wife today. Family drops everything to come to grandma's bedside. He patted my hand. Old man makes new friend. His words collide with my worries, freeing them from the tether I had been holding tight. They float away. I am left with a renewed spirit. My headline now reads, "Woman overwhelmed by the spirit of kindness and the reminder that our capacity to love is never ending." And then I have a teensy little poem to read you. This is a Mary Oliver poem. Oh, and before I read the poem, what I had wanted to do 15 minutes ago was to ask you to contemplate, to pick some issue in your own life. And to take these three principles and to really inquire. Noticing that there's a tendency to keep the teachings at a kind of conceptual level, and then we either strive to get there, or we compare ourselves to somebody else who's much better at it than we are, or we complain about how we're not so great at it, you know. And so the invitation really is to drop all that and to just drop into the inquiry. Mary Louise last week did this beautiful teaching on curiosity and inquiry. So inviting us in these moments. So I just would invite you as a bit of homework to go home and to pick something, whether it's a headline, whether it's global warming, whether it's the person who cuts you off on the street, on the way home, that kid on the scooter who, never mind. Just just to take something very specific and consider those three principles and how you might bring them into play with that, okay? And so here's a little poem from Mary Oliver to close. It's I've read this before also because I love it. In praise of craziness of a certain kind. On cold evenings, my grandmother, with ownership of half her mind, the other half having flown back to Bohemia, spread newspapers over the porch floor, so she said the garden ants could crawl beneath as under a blanket and keep warm. And what shall I wish for myself, but being so struck by the lightning of years, to be like her with what is left, that loving. So I invite us all for homework to be like her with what is left in tiny, small ways. That loving. That's our practice of loving kindness. Okay. Thank you. Blessings.